We are live. Thank you very much for joining me today, Scott. I'm very excited to speak to you on this
Absolutely.
topic because
Absolutely.
you are one of the biggest experts in the field of peaking for bodybuilding, having done a number of papers on this actual topic. And I guess I want to start off with a pretty important question, which is what do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about peak week when it comes to bodybuilding?
I would say that if you're in shape, really in shape, that you have to do anything during a peak week. I'm sort of known for having a way that I like to execute peak week, the way to strategize the different components. But many people do peak week, and outside of the bodybuilding classes, and some of the women's classes where being as shredded as possible is not the look that you want, and people sometimes do peak week in a way that a bodybuilder would. When if you just had a little less body fat, you wouldn't need to do anything. So
Mm.
some people just sort of follow the Pied Piper, I think, and they do a peak week because they think that they have to. But there are many people in the natural bodybuilding world that don't do anything. They just basically keep it as similar as the same as possible, because a lot of times it depends on where you're competing, where you're going. That may be the biggest thing, the biggest hurdle that you have is to try to keep things as consistent as they were during the 10, 12, 20, 25, 30 weeks for some natural competitors,
Mhm.
because you're traveling. If you're on a plane, that can throw off your water balance. You're stressed, which you mentioned before. I think we're going to get into that. So you may need to do nothing other than keep everything the same. So that's I always say that, or I try to at least mention that at some point in time, because people are like, "Oh, look at all the bells and whistles that we can play with that are so cool," and you may not have to even go into that room. Just stay where you're at. If you're in shape, if you're waking up looking the way you want to look, then you're good to go. Just try to hold that look.
Yeah, I guess the phrase landing the plane is something that you hear quite often. That's all
Right.
that peaking is meant to be. It's just a case of what you've worked so hard for across like the last 24, 30 weeks to get to that like level of conditioning
Mm-hmm.
and just ensuring that you actually arrive onto stage remaining that level of conditioning but potentially having a bit more kind of fullness to the physique. So I guess like with that, right, you mentioned about keeping things simple. What would be some of the like, primary variables that you would be looking to manipulate during this week? Because, as you said, there's a lot of levers to pull, and people can obviously get very overwhelmed the more options they do have.
So if we're just talking bodybuilding now,
Yeah.
where you can't be too full, you can't be too hard. You don't have to worry about like some of the women's divisions. They sort of do the opposite. They'll get in really good shape and then they'll water load and avoid contracting the glutes if they're starting to get striations. But assuming those sort of prerequisites, you want to be as full and you want to be as hard as you can and not be flat. Basically, those things. Um, the thing that maybe the second answer to your first question is, I often say shoot for an A, and then when people try to go for an A plus, to try to get a look that is so far away from anything that has shown itself during the peaking or the prep process. That's where people will end up shooting the pooch, so to speak. That's where people will end up dropping the ball,
Mm.
especially in the enhanced area where people just want to get ultra dry and they try to make up for not being in shape and they use a diuretic, let's say. Um, so there should be some semblance of fullness, let's say, and a great way to have been get ready for a peak week is to have some sort of carbohydrate cycling, so sort of carbing up during your prep process so that you know what happens when you look full. You know how full you can get. So it's not a complete mystery. You haven't had to be on minimal carbs for 12 weeks straight without a singular carb up. So you know what fullness looks like. And then you also know what dryness, how dryness varies over the course of the day, or how dry you can be and how dry you could be. So some things, a thing that I sometimes do with people, if I'm coaching them, and I have a like a package too. If people just want to focus on peak week, we would just do that, where you can just if you can't, let's say you got a job that just It takes up too much of your time. You can't literally do an entire practice peak week, which I'm a huge, there's three things probably, maybe that's the other one, is not doing a practice peak week, because you can learn so much in the practice peak week. And ideally, it's exactly like what the peak week would be, to whatever extent that can be possible. But secondarily, the point I was moving towards was you can't just practice a drying out procedure. So reducing your carbohydrate, manipulating your water, having some timing between sodium intake where you're adding salt to your food, you remove that, et cetera, and dehydrate, follow with a scale. That's one of the things that I hardly ever see. And the massive fluctuations in weight that sometimes people will have when they're carbing up and drying out is largely water weight. The glycogen comes with at least its weight in water plus some. That's hard to know. That seems to be quite variable. But most of what's changing in terms of body weight is water weight. And so you can see how dry you are by using a scale. So someone, for instance, who just wants to know how dry they can be so that they don't shoot for the A+++ with the star and everything else from the teacher, can do just a drying out procedure where, let's say, they dry out on a Sunday when they're not training, and then they just see how dry they can get and what that looks like when they're already in good enough shape to be able to see whether it's, they're actually getting dry and they don't have the body fat obscuring the conditioning. So yeah, being full and being dry. And then, of course, I just published, I don't even know if I mentioned this in our exchange, but a paper came out about a month ago now. It's in the Strength Conditioning Journal from the National Strength Conditioning Association on training during peak week. So I was asked to write a review. Guillermo Escalante said, hey, will you do a review on just training? So it was kind of a challenge because all these factors come together, but the focus was just on training. And the point I make in that paper is that when it comes down to it, there were competitions in the days of old where someone would get on stage and be evaluated based on their physique, and then they'd also do a bench press or a curl or something like that. But it doesn't matter what your performance is in the gym. What matters is how well you can pose. That's the performance requirement during peak week too. So that's something that I think is important as well to kind of keep in mind, is that you want to be full, you want to be dry, but you also want to have your wits about you, and that you practice your posing. So in that state where you can feel a little bit wonky, people are thinking, okay, I'm starting to cramp a little bit here. That is definitely physiologically a different place to be, and psychologically you want to have covered your bases in terms of posing so that you can pose regardless of just about how horrible you feel or how thirsty you are or what have you. So having that in place where for instance, you're posing, assuming the posing is still good after your workouts, after you've trained legs, where you don't look that good and it's hard to hold the poses, and you got someone making sure you're not practicing poor posing, that can be a problem. You want to actually be doing things the way you want to on stage. But so being able to have that in place during the peak week, and then not try, and I've seen this before, so this is where all these factors of being full and dry and posing all come together. Not thinking, well, I'm gonna work out my routine in the last 24 hours, and I'm not sure how dry I will be or how full I will be, and people will pose so much that it has an adverse effect on their physique because they use up the glycogen they may have been trying to load in the days previous to all that posing. So those are kind of the big pieces, the big stones to have in place: full, dry, and then be able to pose in that condition. Don't do we talked about old school guys like Paul Dillett. Was a phenomenal bodybuilder, crazy, and the guy just was kind of known as, if this guy just could have posed, if Paul Dillett could have posed like Lee Labrada, it would have been lights out. But he couldn't hit a back pose to save his life. least from the videos I've seen, which was unfortunate. So that plays as big of a role. You probably, I mean, if you're just so superior to someone else, that your posing is at least in the ballpark, then you're probably going to win. But sometimes being a better poser can make the difference between placing as well as you possibly could have and not placing as well as you could have because you can't show your physique. So that needs to also sort of play a role during the peak week, of course.
While we're on that, do you think during a peak week, and I don't know if you looked at this within the paper that you made, that people should alter their posing like down, or they should do more, just because like obviously the training side of things that might decrease a little bit more, might decrease a little bit, but obviously because they're getting closer to the stage, they might want to, you know, make sure all their T's are crossed and all their I's are dotted, so they want to practice their posing more. But as you said, sometimes that can lead to people overposing and burning through more glycogen that they're trying to actually kind of load. So do you think there's a kind of rationale for actually maybe saying, hey, look, realistically at this point you should have done the majority of your posing work, most of your posing prep. This is all about kind of relaxing, de-stressing, and just ensuring that you're ready for the weekend.
You want to be as proficient at posing as possible, and there's a specificity of training. This is why I mentioned sort of posing after a hard workout, or posing for a long period of time, like trying to pose for 5-10 minutes straight, so that you're not the guy who's fading on stage when you're in that third round of call outs, right? So all that should have been done beforehand. The thing that I think I mentioned in this paper that can be done, and I know people who have been competing for decades who would they would concoct their posing routines simply in their head because they were good enough to do that. But you can visualize what you're going to do, so you can practice your posing with mental imagery, and then keep from using up the glycogen. So that's something that can be done. Because I think what happens, and maybe what you're getting at too, is like, okay, I got to make sure I pose really well, and people overpose, and it helps with their nerves, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
But then if they've, for instance, loaded glycogen previously, and then they're going to dry out and not have carbs coming in, then they use up their glycogen. They shoot themselves in the foot. So ideally, you've posed specific to where the posing gets really, really hard. And then you can use some visualization as at least one option to keep the stress down and say, okay, I think I got my posing down. But you'll want to pose to some degree, keeping the glycogen levels in mind, so you can test what's happening with your physique. You can get a sense of how full you're getting. The thing that there's like a full, like I'm on sort of one end of the spectrum. I like to have everyone have done a practice week, so they know, I mean, as many as possible too, like over the course of years. I've had clients, he was a friend who I helped many times. And he got in shape like 2 months before one of his shows. And he literally just did a peak week protocol, like, I think like 7 times in the 10 weeks before the show. Because you can get leaner the way I do things. People end up, definitely doesn't set them back in terms of getting leaner. Mm-hmm. And he just did his pose. So he had that down. By the time the real peak week came in, like, that was just a walk in the park. He'd already walked those steps so many times. So ideally, you know how many carbs it takes to fill you up, right? And there's no like, am I getting full? Am I not getting full? And you know when you're dry and what it takes because you've already done that. And you know when your body weight gets to this level, you're going to be dry. And you check that in the mirror. But that's not your primary source. It doesn't have to be your primary source of feedback, because let's say you start the peak week in a relatively low carb scenario and you're 200 pounds in the morning and you're pretty dry. You carb up, you drop your water, and then the morning of a show, you're 199 pounds after all the carbohydrate. You know that you're going to be dry. Like, you're not thinking. So the mind games aren't going to be playing so much role, because you have this black and white piece of feedback from the scale that says, there's no way after taking in 2,000 grams of carbs in the middle of the week that I don't have glycogen, at least to some extent, and I must be dry because my body weight is at this level. So I don't have to be like, holding up the mirror and checking my glutes like every 5 minutes to see if I'm in shape, because from the other factors in the practice that you've done that.
Mm-hmm.
And to that, and then I'll just like, it's important for people to kind of understand the way I do peak week, and this relates to your question, is to not try to juggle carbing up and drying out simultaneously. Those two processes, and now we can get into the weeds if you want to. Those two processes are antagonistic to one another to some degree. So the way I've set up peak week, in general, there can be some variation, of course, is that you would load until you're absolutely full, and there's no doubt about that. And the glycogen will stay there for several days, as long as you don't pose it away or train it away, and then take care of your water. So checking fullness and dryness and trying to juggle the bowling pin and the flaming torch and the chainsaw that's running all at one time doesn't have to happen. You took care of the bowling ball, you took care of the torch, and take the chainsaw at the very end, or whatever order. So those sort of things, you've knocked them out sequentially, somewhat objectively, because you know how many carbs you took in, you know what your body weight is, etc. And then you don't have to go by feel and look so much. And if you have a third eye, a coach or a friend or several friends, then they can help you with it too. So, but that's how I do peak week, so that you're not in that and this is the difference. Maybe we can get into this between natural and enhanced bodybuilding. Mm-hmm. Is guys will try to carb up while they have a diuretic in place, and that often has really bad results. Those two things can be diabolically opposed, but that's a scenario where you could load carbohydrate potentially and drop water at the same time. Typically, that's the body physiologically, that doesn't happen unless you've got a pharmaceutical diuretic of some sort in place while the carbs are coming in. So carbing up and then drying out in that sequence makes sense to me.
Mm. I do want to come back to this kind of distinction between carbing up and drying out, but I do want to kind of go back to something you talked about already with the practice peak weeks, right? So of course, like as you said, these ideal scenarios that you get somebody to be able to do as many of these as possible.
Yeah.
So I think obviously one thing I want to ask you is like, right, then when you're thinking about even just starting the contest prep in general, obviously you need to have a sufficient amount of timeline there so you can have time to plan in the weeks. So with that, then are you saying, okay, with your off-season conditioning, I never want you to approach a certain level of body fat or a certain visual that would maybe kind of impede your ability to have the time there for the contest prep, right? So a contest prep maybe being for natural, maybe being about 25 to 30 weeks to get truly shredded. So would you say, okay, there's a certain level of body fat that I don't want you going over, so we can have the time to have these in?
Yeah, I've got in my Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book. I feel like I'm a shill now selling my book, but that's a question that I have. I put together a table in there showing what kind of body fat you'll have and what would make sense in terms of how long it's going to take to lose that. So yeah, if you for instance, let's say, want to move up a weight class, and so you need to put on 4 kilos of muscle, and you monitor your body fat, you monitor your fat-free mass, you monitor body composition until you get maybe a kilo or two over that goal, because that's the amount of fat-free mass you have to be 4% body fat on stage. Then you need to know, okay, I'm moving along in my off season, and now I'm 20 weeks out, and I'm going to have to diet down. Well, with this body fat, I could diet down and I'd be ready in 20 weeks. But I don't have the fat-free mass that I wanted to have to reach my goal of being bigger on stage. So that might mean I got to go another year till I get more fat-free mass, because you presume you're going to lose some. This doesn't always happen. Natural competitors have obviously a harder time than enhanced guys would, but you need to keep, like, literally, if you're being goal oriented with coming in improved in terms of body composition, and then having enough time to diet those things off, first you need to have the time to get the fat-free mass, the muscle mass that you want to have. And then depending on what your P ratio is as you're in your off season and putting on size, you may get a kilo of fat for a kilo of muscle mass. Well, then you're going to need at least 2 weeks for each kilo of fat. So that's going to extend your prep, which will potentially also help you hold on to fat-free mass as you're dieting down. So, and then to your question, ideally you're ready, you're absolutely stage ready, shredded like 2 weeks out. You don't want to torture yourself and be in that, like, oh my God, I could just eat my shoe right now. I'm so hungry. That's a potentially dangerous place to be in terms of holding on to muscle size. But if you're going to be absolutely certainly stage ready to get 2 weeks out, then at 4 weeks out, you look good enough where you can see what's going on if you were to do a practice peak week. And the way I've set them up, and it's not the only way that it could be done, but like I mentioned before, I've never had a single person who didn't actually move forward in terms of, maybe one person at some point in time, but it's 99% of the time that people will make progress in terms of fat loss when they do a peak week in the way I set them up. And that includes a really aggressive carb load in the middle of the week. This would be a wonderful thing. I love to see studied more directly. There's a guy named Ken Skip Hill. He does skip loading, and this is how he diets many people down. And you look at the thermodynamics, like, how is this happening with these massive carb loads on the weekends? Sometimes he even has fat in those. It's like, thermodynamically, what's going on with the calories here? Like, how does this make sense? I would love to see someone study that more directly. But I think there might be something like that at work, where you have a low carb period, then you have massive carb up, and then you drop the carbs down in order to drop the water. But if you're going to be ready for sure 2 weeks out, you can do a practice. You have that week of your peak week, which really isn't an extra week you need to add in many cases. In fact, I've had people do a practice peak week to accelerate their fat loss. And some of that is, in terms of body weight, some of it's probably just flushing water too, for someone who's really stressed and they've been dieting for a long period of time. You give them all those carbohydrates, cortisol levels go down, they hold less water, they'll feel much better. And so you could practice it 4 weeks out and 2 weeks out, and then you'd have the peak week itself. And at that point in time, that's old hat, right? But you have to have, planned it ahead of time to be ready 4 weeks out in order for that to even make sense. Like, okay, I got too much fat. I can try to drop water, but I won't really be able to see much. I can still get some idea what's going with the scale. The thing that happens, and this goes back to the very first thing I said, actually the very first question, is the leaner, and I've seen this, like, for instance, when people do multiple peak weeks, and they go through a procedure of loading and then dropping water, is the leaner you get, the faster you drop the water. So the leaner people are, what I think is happening is the fat cells are shrinking, the connective tissue, adipose is a form of connective tissue. So where water would go, the water goes where the fat once was. Those spaces, the interstitial space where the water would go, where the fat once goes, shrinks down as the fat cells get smaller. And this happens more readily when people are younger. The older you get, the less the skin wants to behave the way we want it to. But you drop water more quickly. So that's something that by the time you're really, really in shape, and if you've been in shape for enough weeks that your skin has been able to catch up, so to speak, dropping water isn't a problem, right? And that's why you'll see people who they'll just progressively increase their carbs for 4, 5, 6 days, and then they just go back to their standard prep contest diet, and they're already so lean. There's no water drop procedure that needs to happen because they don't hold water because they're so ridiculously lean. The water of reducing or having a water drop procedure of some sort makes sense mostly when you've carved, I stole this from Ken Hill, I'll give him credit for it, fill and spill. You filled up so much that you spill it over. And that gives you some indication, okay, my glycogen levels are full. Glucose isn't coming into cell. There's an osmotic effect of this glucose that's being backlogged outside of the muscle cells. It's pulling water into the interstitial space, and then you spill over and you see that under your skin. In that case, if you filled and spilled and you've put on, got, like, I know my numbers from myself, but might be like 215 at the beginning of a carb up, and with the water and the carbs, 2,000 grams of carbs or more, I might be 228 or 230. But
No.
then I would come back down to like 210 when I drop my water. That water was going to come off eventually, but you can speed that up if you manipulate water and sodium to some degree, and you don't have to use diuretics to make that happen.
Mm.
That would be the reason why intentional water manipulation would make sense for many, many people, is that they know they have water that they don't want, that's extracellular, that needs to come off. But so yeah, anyway, it's a great question. Like, you know, you gotta be ready soon enough for practice peak week to make sense. And if it's not, and I think I mentioned this in that paper, then a smart decision is like to maybe just find a different show where you're ready.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It all comes back to like the actual positioning of the prep, doesn't it? Like, if
Mm-hmm.
like even going about all of this side of the bodybuilding like sport is even worth it, right? Like actually practicing peaks, because yeah, you need to be lean enough to actually make a peak week work for you. But I
Right.
think yeah, that definitely answers my question in regards to yeah, 2 weeks out is probably a decent enough time to be conditioned for. You obviously have plenty of time there to practice the peak, and then as you come into the actual competition week, you're able to just kind of relax, be like, okay, this is routine now. We know what
Mm-hmm.
the strategy, like how the strategy worked. So it gives you a little bit more confidence coming into the show, which I think is probably something that kind of people struggle with when it does come to peak weeks, right? And they don't practice them. It's that they have nerves coming into the equation. And we talked about stress being something that can get in the way of people being able to kind of bring their best to stage. So you have this change in routine that you spent the last like 20 weeks being really disciplined with food, really disciplined with your cardio, and now all of a sudden you have way more food coming onto the plate. And for some people that can be quite
Oh.
challenging. They see the scale weight
Mm-hmm.
change. As you said there, your weight can go above where you may be comfortable, right? A lot of people tie their progress or their success to the scales during prep, and all of a sudden that's no longer your kind of sign of success, right? But you
Yeah.
are also having to tie it back to, okay, how am I looking at my pictures? And then is your coach also kind of saying, yeah, you're looking good, we're right exactly where we need to be? And that's, I guess, where having that second eye is really, really valuable.
Yeah. The second eye is good. And having done it and seen the procedure happen without the stress of the peak week. So one thing, sometimes I would have people do a peak week in the way that I generally would have folks do it, as much for the reason simply for them to have something to do,
Yeah.
right? And something to focus on. Because like you said that perfectly. It's Groundhog Day for months on end, right? And you're counting everything, and all of a sudden you take the people don't have any problem with reducing the carbs and pushing harder. Like they want to do everything they possibly can, you know, because we're pros at delayed gratification. Want to make this as hard as possible so that you have this magnificent win and the dopamine levels are sky high and blah blah blah. So now you're 3 or 4 days out from the show and you get all this food and you're like, and there's it's in German, a guy named Leonidas Arcona. Leonidas, he's done some arm wrestling with Devin Larratt. Actually, people might
Oh,
know him
cool.
from there.
Yeah.
He's an absolute strength phenom. Like he's just crazy. He bench pressed 100 kilos 78 times. You can find
Wow.
the YouTube. He's just ridiculous. And he did his first show, and he's got a whole series on YouTube called the Mass Diaries or something like that. It's pretty easy to find. And during his peak week, he's just sort of, you know, talking to the camera, and this is his very first show. He's been doing strength stuff, like he's a strict curl champion in Germany and crazy powerlifter, et cetera, et cetera. But he's like, this is so, it's really interesting to see him say, this is so confusing. I feel like I don't deserve these carbs. Like I shouldn't be doing this. I feel really
Mhm.
conflicted. And when you've had a practice peak week where you've done all those things that seem really friggin' bizarre, like all of a sudden I'm having all these carbs and I'm watching myself hold water, and they're like, okay, you can do that and not be so freaked out when the show isn't looming in 3 days, right? But if you try to do that I'll tell you an example. A guy I worked with years ago, crazy genetics, could have easily been a pro. He just had so many things going on in his life. And he said, "Hey, can you bring me into the USA's here in the US?" I think he still got like fifth or something like that. And I said, "Okay, well, let's do a practice for this peak week," because he could have used one, I think. And he just never got it done. He wasn't drinking the water. He like left his water at home, something like that. And then he went to execute the plan when he was already in Las Vegas, and he didn't really understand what we were trying to do. So he went during the period of time when he was supposed to be drinking water and carbing up, and he saw himself holding water. He was in the garage in this house in Vegas where he was staying, wearing a sweatsuit, trying to drop the water, right? And we want to have the water around for the glycogen to load, right? So he was totally shooting himself in the foot because he was freaking out. And I found this out after the fact, right? Trying to drop water when we wanted water retention. Had he done a practice run and seen, okay, this is part of the process, the water will come off. I see my scale weight going up by 8 or 10 pounds, whatever it is, and then it will come back down. And at this time of the day, my scale was like, oh, everything is on plan. It's just like landing a plane, like you said. You're looking at you've got all your metrics there. Let's see, my altitude is going down. My elevation is where I need to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this is good. It's normal for there to be turbulence, so to speak, with the water retention 3 days out or 2 days out when you're ending your carb load. So, and then having a coach who's looking at those numbers and saying, yep, that makes sense. That makes sense. That can be helpful too. I'm big on doing it on your own as much as you can, because I think the mental resilience that comes from being in those really tricky places where you're doubting yourself and then overcoming that doubt gives people a skill set that is just absolutely invaluable, just in general in life. If you can diet down and do all the mental gymnastics to keep yourself from not cheating and change your diet willfully, objectively, et cetera. Like by the time you've done several bodybuilding preps, you got some skills that won't necessarily come from day-to-day life, at least in the modern Western world for many people.
Yeah, I've done one competition season so far, and I'm going to do my next one, 2027. I will be working with a coach, but I would love to prep myself, like just come like fully, because it just seems like a natural progression to the process of bodybuilding, right? And like my coach, do you know AJ Morris?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So obviously
great
he
dude,
himself.
Awesome guy.
Yeah, he coached himself, and he's coached himself for as long as I've followed him. John Jewett also on the Olympia side of things, like he coached himself to a phenomenal degree, so it is very much possible. I think there's the aspect for me that's probably most challenging is just kind of keeping out of my head, because when I did my season 2022, I felt like I probably could have done it on my own all the way up to peak weeks, but in the peak weeks that was the unfamiliar territory because I'd never done it before, right? Like I didn't know what to expect. All the stuff that we talked about there in regards to monitoring scale weight, like what expectations in regards to fluid retention during the week, even down to food selection. That's one thing I think I made some errors on during peak week itself, because I would have been
a lot.
I would have been eating a lot of fruit and veg during my prep, right, just keep myself satiated. But then when it came to like the actual loading period, I think I increased vegetables a little bit more, and I think that took away from maybe some of the carbohydrates or other carbohydrate sources I could have used, having more fiber now in the diet, so I'm not loading as effectively. But like again, these are all different mistakes you're probably going to make in your first contest season anyway. That's the way I put it, so it's only going to get better from here.
And that's the beautiful thing. Like you went through, you those mistakes happened, and you won't do that again, right? Yeah. And that's an experience that you will take with you. I think really that will apply elsewhere. Whereas if you had a coach that just told you what to do, right? And it's something you could have figured out, right? Well, then you wouldn't have, you bypassed that difficult experience and that decision-making process that now you own. That's you have that. So, I mean, I think, I don't know how many I've probably done done like 40 shows. I've probably done 150, 200 peak weeks, maybe something like that. Because there are many times, like when I was between weight classes, I needed to time my body weight so that I could weigh in at a certain time of day. So I would do the peak weeks, and it's like, okay, I need to weigh 198, right? And I'm 6 weeks out, and so I'm weighing at this time of day on the day when I would weigh in 204. Like, okay, cool. I'm weighing 203. Good. If I keep dropping 1 pound per week, I will weigh 198 at 3 o'clock during the weigh-ins when I need to. So I practice tons and tons of peak weeks, but I learned so much from that. Just like AJ, just like John, you learn so much more by doing these things on your own. And the thing is, like, most of us aren't making a living by whether or not we place first or third in a bodybuilding show. Yeah. And the value that you take with you years down the road, having gone through these things, because then you have like, okay, everything else is easy. All the other, the difficult decision-making process, you're well fed, your brain is clear, you can think through those things much more easily, I think, after you've gone through what ironically enough, it's really not that big of a deal if you ate too much vegetables the few days before your show. I mean, world's not going to come to an end. But I really am a big proponent of doing as much of this on your own. And learning from others, asking questions, communicating with people. The information's all out there. But relying on coaches, I'll shut up on this because this is kind of my hobby horse, but it's sort of like people, tons of people run marathons, right? I mean, the New York marathons, there's tens of thousands of people that do that. And we're like, why would you run a marathon? It's, that's crazy distance, takes hours to do. They do it because it's something hard. Yeah. There is a value in the difficulty of the experience. And if people would say, okay, this year, for those who want, just we'll bring a wheelchair out to you for the last 8 miles of your marathon. And we'll just wheel you in. You'll still get your certificate, but you won't have really run a marathon. You'll get, a New York marathon with little asterisks. Like, people are like, why would you possibly do that? And for many people who are the ones who are going to place, 5,632nd in the New York Marathon, no one knows who they are. If you're placing 8th, or like me, like I don't have a pro card, I got pretty close, but I won a few shows, but no one's going to look at the annals of bodybuilding and think, Scott Stevenson was a really good bodybuilder, upper mediocre maybe. But the experiences that I had from those overcoming those hurdles are absolutely invaluable. So peak week it's an opportunity to do that because and this is where people often say, this is where you need a coach. This is the time when if you need a coach more than anything. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the last 3 miles of the marathon. This is what this shit's all about. This is the whole point, is to put yourself in the place where you have a stress to grow from, right? And you have to figure shit out and you can actually say, you know what? I'm at mile 21 here on my marathon, and I know that I typically bonk unless I grab some carbohydrate. So I've made a mental note to grab Gatorade at each of those water stations as I go along, so I have supplement carbohydrate. I'm planning ahead so that I can finish the marathon without the bonk, right? And I've done that because maybe I bonked previously or what have you. And so I'm able to think clearly when I'm 21 miles into a marathon. If you're able to think clearly when you're 20 weeks into a bodybuilding prep and do a practice peak week and look at your body weight and plan out your carbohydrate, think I need to add up 200 grams of carbs on this day and 100 grams on this day, and do all those things on your own, you've developed a certain level of badassery. I think that is something that will stick with you for quite some time. The peak week is so freaking cool too, because you get to see all these changes. You get to see the water come on, which is sort of like, okay, good. I got water. I'm holding. I filled and I spilled, and then you get to watch yourself dry out, and you get to play with so many of these things in so many sort of more dramatic ways than during the course of a grind, day in, day out type of prep, where you do get leaner, and you notice that on occasion. But during peak week, there's so many bells and whistles you can play with that. It's the time that is sort of for me, the most exciting. It's not when you want to give someone else the reins. It's like, give me the reins. This is what it's all about. This is the final stretch. So I like peak week for that point, for that reason, because you get to optimize your physique, potentially get to learn your physique, and you're also you're in the pressure cooker, which is part of what I think makes bodybuilding pretty cool, is that it's really, really difficult, like running a marathon or what have you. And I think it makes you manifest into a stronger person than you would be otherwise, more resilient.
What do you think are some good ways then to remain objective, especially for yourself, self-coaching, like during this period? Because I think that's like probably the biggest reason why people do kind of offset the responsibility to a degree of the peak week, right? It's just so that they don't have to think about it, and they don't have to, again, potentially make mistakes, right? They want to have that certainty there. So,
Right.
like, what are some things that you've maybe learned through all of the piece that you've done for yourself that have just allowed you to stay grounded during that week?
Some of these things, like, there's a big can of worms you open up there.
Okay, we're here for counting the words.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Well, in terms of like the mechanics of peak week, the practice run, and using the scale weight is super important. Like, anchor yourself on those things, and know, of course, like, and you can count your macros. You do know how much water you take in, how much sodium you take in, how you set things up. So having good record keeping. So basically, you're just walking the path you previously walked. The thing that kind of happens that, I've learned in various ways in doing peak weeks and in dieting down, is you get to that point. This is totally normal. This is just the human mind. This is our ego in a certain way. It's like, I put in all these weeks into dieting down, right? And all this effort. And then there's all this pressure to perform and not drop the ball. And, oh my gosh, I need to hire someone else. So, because I'm so anxious about this not working out, and like coming up empty or empty handed at the end of the day, and feeling like, I screwed up. And having the perspective to say, okay, what is really important in life? It becomes so contrasted during those times when you're freaking out about whether or not you have a certain level of dryness on the stage versus whether you don't. Not that that's not cool and not important. Like, you're trying to optimize, you're trying to self-actualize, et cetera, but also realizing that, okay, this is my ego that's freaking out here. This is where is my self-esteem centered? Am I a worse person if I drop the ball here? No, I just made a mistake, which I can correct some point down the road. So it allows you to gain a certain amount of perspective on the relative importance of the things that we see as being like, oh my God, this is everything. I have something, I stole this from someone. I don't know where I got it. I probably should Google around and see if I can figure out what the source was, but I called it the rule of fives. It's kind of a psychological, it's a series of questions you can ask yourself in any order to try to like center yourself and see how important is whatever it is that's disturbing me in the moment really is. And so the questions are, okay, will this matter in 5 seconds? Will this matter in 5 minutes? Will this matter in 5 weeks? Will this matter in 5 years? And so you can ask those questions. It doesn't matter if it's months or years, whatever the time scale is, but you say to yourself, will this matter in 5 years? This thing that seems like it's the most important thing in the absolute world, will it? No. In 5 years? No one's, because I'm not going to win this show. This isn't about getting my pro card and getting sponsorship to put money on the table or have. For some people, it might. In that case, then you have a different answer. But will this matter in 5 seconds? The fact that, I don't know, I'm going to get my number, at the athlete's table, and this asshole walked just cut the line, and I'm all pissed, right? And I'm like, this motherfucker, and I'm starting to stress, and I feel myself sweat. I'm like, okay, I'm going to hold water. Will this matter in 5 minutes? No, it won't. Like, not at all. So I will. You can apply a rule like that in these times of stress. And the stress allows you to develop perspective. It's through it's the difficult things in life that make us stronger. So as you start to move into a peak week, as the weeks sort of count down, this is one of the things that I've gotten from doing the shows that I did over the years in various ways, is perspective on how lucky I am to get to be able to do this. I'm intentionally restricting my food so I can go to ridiculous levels of low body fat, and I'm taking
Hmm.
all these supplements that many people can't afford, et cetera, et cetera. And as you then get down towards peak week, if you've developed a sense of gratitude and perspective, and maybe even had like a gratitude journal,
Hmm.
where you write down, like, this is your training journal, this is what you did for this day. And today I'm thankful that my ankles haven't been bothering me because I had ankle problems when I was a kid, or whatever it is, right? Write down those things. By the time you've gotten into peak week and you've realized, okay, I'm hungry and I'm grouchy, but geez, there are people who can't afford to eat. I should be really lucky to do this. That gratitude will be able to anchor you during the peak week. And you realize, you know what? This is just the last mile of the marathon, and all the people are gathered around and cheering me, and this is the fun part, right? I'm here, I get to do the show, I get to be social with people, gonna have a nice big meal afterwards, et cetera, et cetera. And if you've gathered together that, if you've sort of shifted your perspective as you got to peak week, then the peak week takes on a totally different role in your life, than if you're just stressed out about trying to dot every I and cross every T and get the A+ and not disappoint people or what have you. So that, I think, the psychological feature of realizing that the work's been done.
Hmm.
This is the time to maybe turn some dials and have some fun. And it's not the end of the world. In 5 years, it may not matter. In 50 years, it won't matter because I won't even be alive, potentially,
Hmm.
So that's what peak week can be, literally a time for having, you actually have maybe some free moments because you're not doing cardio, at least when you started the carb up in many cases, to just be introspective and to realize, wow, how glorious is this that I get to actually do a peak week and I get to travel, to wherever I'm going for my show, etc. And when you have that kind of perspective, like, you're on top of the world. This isn't like, nerves. You're happy to be there, right? And
Yeah.
that will keep people from dropping the ball during the peak week because they're happy that it's actually happening in the first place. They're not
Yeah.
resisting it, they're welcoming it.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you bring up a number of phenomenal points there because, like, obviously, we're going to talk about stress management at some point. We're kind of talking about it right now, right?
Right.
Because I think that type of perspective is so useful in the context of the peak week. That like, will this matter in 5 seconds, 5 minutes, like 5 days, 5 weeks, whatever, like that,
Mm-hmm.
that is incredibly useful. And it's something that, you'll use from time to time, even like a poor training session, maybe you have a poor placing in the competition, being able to say, well, is this the last time I'm ever going to do a peak week? No. So we can learn from this and get better for the next one. Last time I'm ever
Mm-hmm.
going to do a show? No. Well, we've got another opportunity, another off season ahead of us, so we can get better for the next one. And it kind of allows you to have that, like, as I said, bit of perspective that if you are into it, right, if you're into bodybuilding, like
Right.
making a couple of mistakes here or there in any part of the process is very much part of the process. It's as part of it as actually having the successful peak weeks.
Mm-hmm.
The bad peak weeks are as part of it, right? And I think something you mentioned there in regards to gratitude journaling, that's also something that would be very useful during something like peak week, where you have a million different things on your brain. You're thinking about possibly everything that could go wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
you also are in a position where you're thinking about the things that could go wrong on a peak week where you've worked a number of weeks to get there, right? You're in that position to have those worries, and isn't that so nice that you have those stresses, like relative
Yeah.
to other stresses that you could have in life? And I think this is something that I think when people are doing bodybuilding, they don't. Sometimes it can be hard to have that perspective because they're always focused on like achieving the goal, and there is a lot of like perfectionistic like kind of traits that will be embodied by bodybuilders too, and it can be hard for them to accept that failure is part of the process, and be able
Mm-hmm.
to find the the learnings and the wins that can come about from that, and even just the small things. One thing you mentioned there is the hunger. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm so lucky that I've had 500 grams of carbs today, and I'm still hungry, and I can still have I could still have more carbs if my coaches prescribe it to me, or if I feel like I need it. Like I have
Right.
the opportunity there to go into the fridge and still have more carbohydrates, but I choose not to because I need to stick to the plan that I've laid out for myself, whatever it may be. Like I think they are just such useful mindsets for people to start adopting through the whole bodybuilding process. Never mind peak week.
Yeah, it's funny. Like we're kind of moving towards the topic in the ethics of sport arena, where people are philosophers discuss like what's the purpose of athletic endeavor, right? Like why do you run a marathon? Why do you play tennis? Why would you arm wrestle? What have you? And for some sports, let's say, I don't know, it's skeet shooting, right? You see the world's best skeet shooter, and that person's it's like people aren't running up to get that person's autograph or what have you. There's no external reward that comes about from that, right? The person does that because the intrinsic reward of self-actualization, of figuring out who they are, of self-improvement, et cetera, is the reward in and of itself, right? The journey is the destination, so to speak. And in bodybuilding, we've got these internal rewards, which is what we've been talking about: gratitude, perspective, this sort of thing. But you've also got probably about as obvious of an external reward that you can get, in that you're just a freak of nature. If you're really, when you diet down or if you dress that way or what have you, you're highly noticeable. So you can, it's very easy to, especially as you get better as a bodybuilder and people are constantly giving you compliments, for the ego to be very impressed with itself as to how awesome your physique has become. And then you get very focused, going back to peak week, on optimizing all of those things and all the internal rewards of why would this endeavor be valuable. And there's a question that I've seen many people ask, and I kind of wonder, but it's something for everyone listening to ask themselves, like honestly ask themselves, if the question is, if social media didn't exist, how many people would still be doing bodybuilding if they couldn't go and post pictures of themselves and, get people oogling them or whatever? And I don't know. It would be interesting that you can't really ask that question directly, but unless maybe we have some catastrophic event and the internet goes down and we see how many people are still bodybuilding. But I remember I used to, when I was a college professor years ago in California, one of the professors actually died suddenly, who used to teach the weight training classes. So I filled in for him. It was an unfortunate circumstance, but it's kind of cool. I got to teach weight training. Normally as a professor, you don't get to do that stuff. So normally they just open up the gym and let them go and futz around. But I tried to create some structure. And I remember teaching the students how to do deadlifts, right? I said, this is not something you'll see all the time, but deadlifts are one of the hardest exercises you can do. It's going to make everything relatively easier, and blah, blah, blah. And I used to say that, if I were on a deserted island and I only had one exercise I could do, I probably would do deadlifts with palm trees that had fallen over. And they would look at me and go, why the hell would you work out if you're on a deserted island? Right? And I remember laughing because they had made a very good point. But for me, it doesn't matter. Like I'm very lucky. There's reasons for this. I know this comes from my family of origin, probably a genetic component, but that external reward hasn't been the carrot that has been dangled in front of my head, that like, I just want to be, this big badass that people are scared of, or people think is just awesome, whatever. The intrinsic rewards have always been more appealing to me. But I think that if people ask themselves that question about social media, or they get to the point, and this can be a sort of an interesting, almost contradictory reward of not placing well at a show, is that you get humbled to a certain degree and you realize there was so much more to this competition prep that I did, or to this process, than being the person who wins, because there's always going to be someone with better genetics, better structure, better shape, what have you. And you kind of can get a little bit of maybe a slap in the face or a wake up call, or just maybe more subtle perspective on all the intrinsic rewards that are important, that can be had with bodybuilding if you just don't focus on what your physique looks like and what your body looks like. And that's it's the beauty of bodybuilding in a certain way is that I think just almost like, because it's can be such a painful process. It can be, there can be so many, it's a very difficult thing to intentionally diet yourself down, or to, be in an off season when you're uncomfortable and you don't want to eat any of the meals that you're eating, and the training itself is difficult. So there's so much potential for personal enrichment that happens there. And at the same time, you can really feed narcissism tremendously with bodybuilding. So there's a certainly contrast there, because a lot of sport athletic endeavors or personal endeavors, like let's say someone becomes really good at meditation, and they get themselves into a seated position that becomes very, very uncomfortable, and their legs start to go numb, and they have to come up with psychological strategies to continue and move past that, go through the valley of pain, as it's sometimes called, right? And there's a valley of pain that you have to go through in certain ways with bodybuilding. But that person gets done with those meditative experiences, and they don't have, no one's clocking them on the street and saying, oh, I bet that guy can meditate for an hour and a half, unlike anyone else. But you see a bodybuilder, and sometimes I've known bodybuilders who actually relish the idea that people would be scared of their physical presence. So, right, they wanted people to freak out when they saw them, because that was part of their feedback, that they're on the right, that they become sort of a monster, right? So there's the full gamut of people think, oh my God, you're awesome, and they fawn over you, or people are scared of you, or what have you. You can armor yourself with bodybuilding in a way that becomes very much an egotistical type of endeavor. So those two things happening simultaneously, the point I'm getting at is that creates for a sort of a unique kind of opportunity for personal growth, because the meditator has growth through the meditation, but there's no allure of people, of the ego saying, it's obvious that I'm the world's best meditator because, I float. I just sort of float around and people can tell. But as a bodybuilder, people know that. So your ego is always tugging you and pulling you away. So you have to be able to balance that in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, I kind of got off track, but I think having the gratitude in place helps during the peak week as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, the tangent is appreciated, because it made my brain go to some interesting places. Like one question I have here on that is, one of my main reasons why I have decided to stay natural, right, is because I could never see myself coming off and then shrinking down, right, or having to shrink down, and I'd find it very difficult for me going to the gym and maybe not being able to train the same way I used to, or perform at the similar levels. And I wonder, because a decent amount of pro bodybuilders or people who used to be at the highest levels of the sport, do you think that maybe some people, when they're kind of going through their come up in bodybuilding, right, they have that intrinsic drive to bodybuild, to work hard, and then for so many years their physique and how good their physique is becomes that external reward. They're getting money for it, they're getting prize for it, they're getting talked about their physique, and then that becomes almost too tied to their sense of self, and that then when they maybe retire from bodybuilding, they come off the sauce, they kind of lose that work hard in the gym kind of sense of self. Do you kind of get where I'm coming at from with this question?
Yeah, the identity becomes wrapped up in the physique. Yeah. And the reason for training is to maintain that identity. Yeah. And when that identity is no longer going to be maintained, there's no point in training, because there's no reward that comes from the training, right? They don't get anything out of going in and testing themselves. It's Like I feel when I go, like I've been training in my barn here in my backyard for years now. I've got a membership at a gym, but I hardly go there. It's just if I happen to be that direction, I've probably been there. I don't think I've been there in the last year. I probably should cancel my membership. Um, I just like the training. That's always been highly attractive to me. And, I do have a mirror in there. It was a wall on a closet that I found on the side of the road. I'm like, oh, that could be a nice mirror to have just, for make sure I'm symmetrical. But, um, I like just doing that because I just like the training, right? And I'm so happy that, I feel really blessed that I actually have that perspective on things. But yeah, that's the especially with someone who has gone enhanced and you put on another 50 pounds of muscle, you transform yourself, and then you become identified with that physical body. Which can't be maintained, well, some people do, but it typically shortens your life expectancy, sometimes drastically depending. So that's another of the potential beauties of bodybuilding is coming to recognize what you identify. And this has been a kind of a personal theme for me in the last few years. Is we all have, unless you become enlightened, unless you've just seen past it all, we all identify in some way, shape, or form with some something from our past. There's some personal identity that we have created in ourselves. That's what our egos sort of do, right? And in at least in the Western world, it seems like many people have. They identify with being a victim. There's and not necessarily like, oh my gosh, like the world's out to beat me up, but like when something is done wrong to you, you're the victim. Like that's the bad guy and I'm the good guy, for instance. And bodybuilding then allows you to change that identity and you become the guy who is the badass, right? Or you become the big guy, or you become armored with the muscle that you gain. Bodybuilding then is an interesting way in which after you've done it long enough, you can see, and of course, if you stop doing it, if you've been enhanced especially, you can see clearly that physical form is going to go away. Like that's transient. That's not who I am, right? If you're open to that. And there are this is why I think, this is coming back a little bit closer to the topic of bodybuilding in the not so esoteric, is you see a lot of, or I sense, having been at this for a while, that there are a lot of bodybuilders who were very prominent who then just vanish. They go away, you hear nothing from them. And like, for instance, talking about gear use, since you brought it up, I know just from some friends who are pros who've experienced this, that there are in the women's ranks, for instance, in wellness, maybe in women's physique too, there's been a trend, especially lately, that, before you learn even how to train properly, you're already on 10 milligrams of Anavar a day, right? They kind of go right to that. And I've got a friend who's a wellness competitor, a pro, and she knows innumerable pros, people she competed with at the higher levels when she was getting her pro card, who became pros then. And because there's so many wellness competitors, they no longer are the outstanding athlete, and they just vanish. They go away, and they disconnect from all of that. They move away from all of that. So that psychologically is not. I don't think that's ideal. That's not an optimal place to be in. And you have, if you're in an alternate universe, some of those women, if they didn't go on stuff and they didn't have the allure of competing and becoming like, it's absolutely, some of the wellness competitors are absolute friggin' badasses, right? There's just like the women's competitors these days are just incredible. And when you become so attached to that, that's something that you may or may not want to continue doing for decades on end. You run the risk of, maybe in the grand scheme of things, this is okay. Maybe this was part of your life's plan to go and figure this out and have to go into this place where you develop this identity with your physical form, and then you let it fall away, and then you have to figure out who the heck you are for the next 5 or 10 years when you're maybe a little dysphoric or depressed. But yeah, this is one of the, I think, things that is beautiful about bodybuilding in sort of a bizarre way, is that if you are someone who was probably set up for whatever reason to identify, or someone who maybe was going to have a body dysmorphia of some kind, or sort of a poor body image, then bodybuilding will allow you to move through that process of self-development, identifying, and then learning how to de-identify, because it sort of amplifies the problem. It puts a microscope on it and allows you to put a microscope on it, and allows you to just make a caricature out of your body, especially when the PEDs come into play. And then when you step away, like, wow, that's pretty. Now I see clearly that there was an underlying psychological issue there that then I can address, and then I can potentially make my life better. And bodybuilding allowed me to do that. And in the short run, you don't want to say, okay, let's get you addicted to PEDs or what have you, and put you through this hell. But bodybuilding does sort of present a way for people's issues to be amplified so that they're evident, and then they can be addressed. So that I see as a good thing, but that's just sort of my spiritual take on things. Is, we have these paths, and if something's more difficult or more like, give me the tough shit, right? That's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to avoid my inner demons. I want to take them on. So bodybuilding will amplify those demons, pull them out of the cave so that you have to go to war with them. And identifying with your physical form, I think, is in your body in the amplified way that it can happen with competitive bodybuilding, can be the demon for many people who come and then go.
Yeah, it's a very interesting, like, as a topic or interesting conundrum, because I guess it's completely different to an athlete in a field sport, right? So somebody plays football their whole life and they stop playing football, they just are not playing football anymore. Like, they'll probably still be watching football, still interested in football. They still seem as if they're relatively the same person, whereas somebody stops bodybuilding and competing in the sport, and then they also stop training, they kind of change bodies. And when you see yourself in the mirror, that can be really, really difficult to kind of wrap your head around, especially if it is a drastic change.
Yeah. We were talking before, and this has been made public, so hopefully we'll just presume that this was the actual story, but this is what I believe has been made public. Is Dorian, I've seen this in documentaries, so I think it's pretty true, but Dorian Yates is an example of someone who, when it was time to hang up the posing trunks, really wasn't quite sure what to do. He went into kind of a dark place. And I believe he may have, and I think you could maybe Google this, make sure. I mean, if we need to cut it out, we can. But I think he's done some ayahuasca journeys as well, which can kind of open up people's consciousness. Okay, good. I didn't think that was pretty too much of an unknown thing. But that will allow people to step away from whatever it is their ego is identifying with, right? So he's an example of someone who has reinvented himself. He's still connected with bodybuilding, but from what I can tell, and maybe I'm presuming things, but I like to think he's an example of someone who moved past. Like, he was the best bodybuilder in the world. Some people say the best bodybuilder ever, maybe second to Ronnie, what have you. But if ever there was anyone who would identify with and have a difficult time letting go of that physical form, it would have been Dorian. And he did have some difficulties, but then he gained an enlightened perspective on it. So yeah, that's what it happens. The ironic thing, or maybe it's just the nature of things, is that the more successful you were, the more difficult it becomes to let go of that identity. So, like you mentioned, football players, like I think sometimes the football players who were, the superstars, and they were world famous, and I think that's where you tend to see the difficulty in letting go of that stardom, because then they really become, the ego says, okay, this is who I am. And then when people don't know who you are anymore, and you're not that important, so to speak, then you have to let go of that, right? But if you're just the guy who, was an NFL player who looked great, maybe you're a little more fit and you're a little bit bigger when you played, but you were a second stringer. Some people might know who you are, but you weren't getting recognized every time you walk through an airport or what have you. And then you retire and you made your money and you're doing well. There's nothing, you didn't lose anything, right? Because you weren't identified with that. Or some people were, some people weren't. So some people don't identify. Like I had a period of time where when I was in school to become an acupuncturist, and I had been competing for several years, and I had a couple years when I was taking my board exams, and I had various things going on, and I stopped pushing my body weight. Everything came down. I was in the like 80s, something like that, and I'd been previously up to 250, 260, and I was scared. I was like, okay, what's going to happen here, right? What's going to go on? And I was okay. I was actually fine, right? And the interesting thing was, and this is the thing that a lot of guys don't get. It's an age-old thing, but guys tend to think that women are more attracted to the really super muscular guys, and a lot of times that's not the case. And I actually, for like the first time in my life, was getting attention from women when I'm thinking my physique is like pales into comparison of what it once was. And so I got a kind of an eye-opening perspective when I became, when I really lightened things up quite a bit. I came way down, and I was more appealing. I was more socially appealing to the average person, because it's not like this giant meathead, lumbering through wherever he goes, who's obviously got an anger problem, and he'd like to just, chop my head off as much as say hello. So I was very happy. I didn't know with that, but I wasn't sure how I was going to react to that. And I had other things going on. I think maybe this is a thought for someone who might be listening to this. At that time, for instance, I was in school, I mentioned, for acupuncture. So there were no bodybuilders in the most people weren't even doing like regular, exercise at a gym. There was a lot of martial artists, but it was a very different crowd. And I was creating another identity in a certain way. I was bridging, so to speak, in becoming an acupuncturist and getting my acupuncture license and teaching at the school and this sort of thing. So I didn't have a void. The void was filled with the building of a new identity. And I think that's the thing. Like, unless you become, an Eckhart Tolle or someone like that who just like, let's go all together, there's going to have to be some identity or some perspective on who you are when you let go of a physique that's been that extraordinary. But going back to what we were talking about before with Peak Week and a gratitude journal, is if you're grateful for just having had the opportunity to do the things that happen with bodybuilding. And this may have been part of it. Like, one of the things I attributed to why I was able to sort of handle that period when I shrunk down quite a bit, and wasn't quite sure, is that I had, previous to studying acupuncture, I had done some research with people with spinal cord injury. I did some postdoctoral research, and I was bodybuilding at the time, and I was very anchored in my physical form. And we were taking in people who were living normal lives, some of them athletes too, who just out of the blue, out of nowhere, completely unexpected, they had an accident and now they're paralyzed. Their whole entire life was changed. And that was really difficult to see. I've got tons of stories from that time, but it made me feel uncomfortable, because I was faced with, and even though I hadn't had a spinal cord, but I was faced, with the possibility I could drive home and get in a wreck and be in this hospital for a spinal cord injury tomorrow. Could happen. Life can be taken from us at any time. So that was like one experience where, working with those folks with spinal cord injuries, I developed a massive gratitude for just having this vessel with which I could do bodybuilding, and being really thankful for it. So when I'm no longer, 260 pounds or 240 pounds or whatever, and I'm a more normal size, I'm still thankful to have this body. Thank goodness. And I could be someone who has to work around having a spinal cord injury, or I could have had a stroke where I'm paralyzed on one side. There's so many things that it could be much more difficult in terms of my physical body than just not being, a massive bodybuilder anymore. And when dieting down and doing gratitude types of journaling things and gaining that perspective on this is all just really a gift that I get to do all of this. When it's over with, you're thankful for the gift that you got, right? And it's not like, oh man, it's like, I'm so happy I got to have these things. It's you don't miss them so much because it was a blessing in the first place. You're lucky to have even been in the situation where you could do bodybuilding in this way, shape, or form. So I think you can, as you're doing bodybuilding, you can prepare yourself for the day, which will come for most people when you step away from at least the highest levels of performance. And maybe you do lose you can no longer identify with that massive bodybuilder because that's not who you're going to be if you want to at least be healthy and live a longer life. So,
yeah, I think with those type of people have those problems. I mean, as you said, can be grateful for those problems. Another person would trade their problems for those problems any day of the week. And also an important thing is like anytime we kind of find ourselves in that position, right, where it's like you're finishing up a sport and you're starting to lose your identity. Like if you have come across an identity first and foremost, you probably find like your next one and like you find your next kind of interest, your next hobby. If you find yourself your way into a situation, you can find your way out of the situation, because by the time you get to that point, you already have all the kind of years of experience and years of actually living to be able to kind of think about, okay, what is the kind of next venture for me, whatever that may be, right? I guess like obviously to circle back a little bit to the kind of peak week scenario, right? Because I think we talked a lot about the gratitude, the stress. I guess you could put all that in terms of like stress management and future stress management.
Yeah, I was having the same thought, right? Like if you've gone through peak week and you've dealt with those difficulties and like, well, then ending your bodybuilding career isn't that big of a deal because you've built up a sort of mental resilience and perspective that you carry over in the rest of your life when the bodybuilding is in the rear view.
Yeah. It's that going back to the will it matter in 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 years, again, right. When it's all said and done, will you really be? You'll be looking back on the bad peak weeks with a bit of fondness, like,
oh yeah,
I was such an idiot back then, wasn't I? I can't believe it did that.
It's funny though, like the stories that people tell, like when people get together or what have you, a lot of times are the stupid shit you did.
Oh
right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It's all the crazy stuff where you almost died, or you cut your finger off, right? Or you beat each other up. Like it's so those things that we kind of dislike in the moment are the things that we relish in the future. Ironically enough. Yeah.
I guess some questions I have for you on still in regards to the peak week. Like I know we mentioned we'd come back to the carbing up and drying out at some point.
Okay, yeah.
Even if it was like 40 minutes later. With the carbing up, right? One question I have for you on this is, when you were kind of recommending people select a carbohydrate amount that they will start to load with, like would you go off like a gram per kilogram like range, or would it be saying, okay, obviously your calories are going to be scaled to your individual needs. Your carbohydrates, as a result, are already going to be scaled to individual needs. So on the carb up, let's go 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever it may be, up to heavy loading. And then I guess from there, how are you assessing when that's enough carbohydrates? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the numbers from the research in terms of being in a relatively glycogen depleted state to creating super compensation, like 10 grams per kilogram per day. If you do that for 2 days, you're going to be full. Like there's just no doubt about it. If someone has been cruising in, they're in shape and they're dieting down, their carbs aren't that low, then they probably don't need that much. This is where the practice run will give you some idea. If we decide maybe just simply to have peak week in place that gives them something to think about and something to do that's new and different. And you're going to do sort of not an intentional, we're going to just get completely devoid of glycogen, but you're going to have a preparatory period where carbs are low and you use up the glycogen that's remaining in the muscle to some degree, not intentionally bring it to zero. So the glycogen levels are pretty low, then you can probably go with the 10 grams per kilogram for a couple of days. And that would be like train legs on Sunday, do a push on Tuesday and do a pull on Wednesday, and then carb Wednesday and Thursday at 10 grams per kilogram.
Okay.
But so that, like, the way I like to do this is with the fill and spill. So
yep.
You can look at those numbers. The thing is that's interesting. Glycogen levels vary. Almost no one's going to go and get a biopsy done or get there's other ways, in non-invasive ways you can measure glycogen, but you're not going to get that done. But you do know that if you eat 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram per day for 2 or 3 days in a row, most people are going to be pretty fucking full. I've actually had a guy who he told me this beforehand because he'd been competing for some time, that he needed like 5 days to fill out. And he did, as it turned out. So, I mean, some things that can play a role there too is people have to realize that, that let's say, for instance, you have, let's say you have 1,000 grams of glycogen that could be stored in muscle. So that's 4,000 calories. Just for someone who's pretty low on glycogen in all the major skeletal muscles, everything that's being trained. So that's 4,000 calories. And if someone says, they're taking in, let's say, 2,000 calories, that's their standard diet during their prep, and then they just go to 3,000 calories for 2 days, and they add an extra 250 grams of carbohydrate, they're at 3,000 calories. Well, that's only an extra 1,000 calories per day. That's 2,000 calories of extra carbs in this case. And that's only half of that 4,000 calories they needed to get the 1,000 grams of carbs in. So a lot of people, especially because they're used to dieting in and they're used to doing things like eating lots of vegetables and those sorts of things to keep their GI full, to keep hunger at bay, drinking extra water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, will tend to under carb up, and you don't know how full you can get until you've really, really pushed the carbohydrates, which could happen with a practice run, or sometimes it happens. I mean, you see people after shows who put on like 10 pounds and they really don't hold a lot of water. And they're like, why didn't I do this beforehand? Like, you can look really, really good in those weeks thereafter. And that's just glycogen and water that's coming in. So I think a lot of people will underfill. I think it's really, really, for various reasons. You do a lot of times, and this is psychologically difficult, have to switch to foods that are more calorically dense, but that in some way, shape, or form resemble something that you've had in your prep diet up to that time. So if you, let's say you haven't been eating hardly any glutinous foods or what have you, and not that you're celiac, but you just eat pancakes and bagels and all these baked goods that typically you haven't been eating, you could create massive GI distress. So it's good to have the foods that you're going to carb up in to get all those extra carbs in your diet in some way, shape, or form. That changes what is going on in your microbiome of your gut, interestingly enough. So that number, I think it holds pretty true. Like, and this is why I use the fill and spill idea, is because many people are underestimating how much glycogen they could be storing, and de novo lipogenesis purely from carbohydrate sources, when you're not eating a lot of fat at that time, right? Because you're just trying to get the carbohydrates in. The fat loading, if you decide you want to do that, can happen before the carb load, and then after the day when you're dropping your water. So if you eat, let's say your caloric balance is 2,000, and you eat 4,000 double that each of those 2 days, that gets you that 1,000 grams of carbs, the extra 4,000 calories. And then you're full. You still haven't had a caloric excess because you still have your energy demands for the day.
Yeah.
And but that's twice your caloric intake that you've been taking in. That's a huge jump. A lot of people really have to push the carbohydrate. And when you spilled over, assuming you're keeping your water intake the same and your sodium intake the same. If you start messing with that, then you've got, you can't really say that the fill and spill thing is telling you, not that it's a black and white, now your glycogen levels are full. But if you take in all those carbs and you've gotten to the point where you spilled over after 2,000 grams of carbs or 1,500 grams of carbs or 1,000 if you're a smaller competitor, then you're pretty sure. But you really don't run the risk of taking in too many carbs isn't going to do you a disservice as long as you have time to get the water off. But underdoing the carbs potentially could. And the thing that we don't really know, it's really interesting. I mean, there's this idea you've probably seen that that's like 2.7 grams of water per gram of carbohydrate stored as glycogen. I mean, that number comes from studies from the liver of rats is where that particular value comes from. And roughly 3 grams to 1 is something you have there. You do see in some studies with humans, but there's actually a study with endurance athletes, and the ratio of water per gram of glycogen was all over the place. It varies tremendously. And what we also don't know for sure, but this is the presumption. And I mean, just understanding a little bit about cell biology, it makes sense, is once you've loaded the glycogen, since that does have an osmotic effect that pulls the water in, the idea would be then if you haven't used up that glycogen, then that water would remain in the cell alongside the glycogen, which is still there in the loaded state, so to speak. And then if you do become relatively dehydrated, and this is not the scenario where someone's using a pharmaceutical diuretic per se, but you do get your body water low, having the glycogen there will mean that water stays there. You may lose some of that intracellular water because there's going to have to be some homeostasis there between the extra and intracellular components. But there's a little bit of evidence suggesting that you do keep some of that intracellular water, which is a large part of the fullness that you get from a glycogen load. 2 or 3 to 1 is the ratio, could be more, could be less, of water to glycogen. So, you wouldn't want to load with all the glycogen, get all the water in. And this is why when people use pharmaceutical diuretics, and I've never used those with my athletes. I just don't do it. It's just, there's no reason to. You can get really, really dry, plenty dry without doing that. But you put in a pharmaceutical diuretic, especially if you run the risk of using one that's not potassium sparing. And then if you lose potassium's your main intracellular electrolyte, and then you can then the cells will crenate, then the muscle cells will shrink. When you rob them of potassium, you shoot yourself in the foot. And you need to have potassium for an effective glycogen load to happen too, interestingly enough. If people are hypokalemic or devoid of potassium, you don't store glycogen, interestingly enough. It won't store, like literally glycogen levels won't change unless there's adequate potassium there, because the potassium has to be available for the cell volume to increase as the water comes in. So the water and the glycogen are intimately connected along with potassium, which is there just for keeping charge balance across the cell membrane, etc. So anyway, you don't run the risk of taking in too many carbs. Really, you're not going to get fat from that. But it can make a huge difference in terms of weight and muscle fullness in the end run. And even let's say you even you took in an extra, 500 grams of carbs, right? 2,000 calories, right? So that's a little bit more than a half a pound of fat, right? But in doing that, you got a half a pound of fat, but you got an extra 4 or 5 pounds of stage muscle. That's a pretty good ratio. You maybe lost a little bit, but your fullness is much better. And I really don't think that's going to happen because, like I said, the de novo lipogenesis, you have to really load up on carbs in a caloric excess for days on end before that really comes into play. So you can take in about as many, the limitation is GI for most people, and finding foods that they can take the carbs in, or having enough time to do it. If you just give yourself 12 hours to get those carbs in, that won't cut it for many people who've been using a low carb diet strategy to get to the point where they're stage lean. So
yeah, I think as you're saying there, the like actually filling to the point of spilling over, like you can always correct that, right, with the following day, the day where you manipulate, where
I
you might
plan that
manipulate
in.
water, you might manipulate carbohydrates, or might manipulate fat, whatever it may be. Because yeah, it's definitely like when I was doing my own season, like I don't know if it really pushed the carbohydrates as much as possible, and some of that can also just be fear based. You know, if you
Yeah.
haven't practiced trial run, you don't want it to potentially be, as well as depending on how you set up your strategy, right? Like whether if you are doing like a traditional backload where like you actually are doing like the Thursday and Friday and then you're competing on Saturday and you've got no time really to course correct it, then that's like, yeah, that could be a lot more of a shoot in the dark, a lot riskier, unless that has been practiced a good bit. And then as you're saying in regards to the limitations being like like just the ability to get in that much food is obviously a large component there, which I guess makes sense as to why people may kind of spread their loading across a couple of days.
Yeah,
One question you had,
for sure.
one question I have in regards to, you mentioned potassium there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one strategy I've seen implemented by a number of different bodybuilders, a lot of bodybuilders in the UK, is they go really hard on the potassium containing foods. So you'll
Mm-hmm.
have people eating literally kilos of potatoes and
Yeah.
like a whole like fucking bunch of bananas. Is that really something that would be worthwhile doing, or is that more so like something you've seen maybe a good pro doing, and it's like, okay, we're gonna follow suit here? Or, because obviously they do contain carbohydrates and they contain potassium, but
Yeah.
I'd be looking at that and saying that's a lot of high volume, like very tough on the GI food to be getting down. You gotta be bloated like fuck.
Yeah. The practice run will tell you. I mean, you want to have
Yeah.
adequate potassium. I have tried in the past. I haven't done this for a long time, but like taking potassium, like the 99 milligrams potassium pills.
Oh,
You
yeah.
can't buy them in higher because you take too much potassium. This is not a good thing for your heart, so you have to be careful. Having potassium built into your carb source does ensure that, but you're right. You're asking for GI issues. I've had clients who just want to use, they use sweet potatoes because they fill up really well on them, but then at the same time they have GI. They're pooping a lot too. Like they're literally like loose stool like 4 or 5 times a day. Um, that's not something you want to be doing, like for years on end. But if you found that that gives you the look you want, there are probably more hazardous things you could
Yeah.
do yourself. Do Marcus Ruhl did
Oh,
he
yeah.
won the New
I know
York
him.
Pro in like
Yeah.
2002 when he was just crazy. I'm trying to remember the numbers. I've seen the interview, but he basically carved up primarily on oatmeal,
Lovely.
right? Yeah, and it was after, I think, the night after the show, because he'd been carving up like up to the prejudging in the night, and his said he just lied in his hotel room in just absolute agony.
I
I
can
think it was
imagine.
the night
Yeah.
afterwards because he had all this soluble fiber in his GI. And I don't know what happened. The next day, he may have spent that extra day in his hotel room on the toilet, right? But like that was one of the most impressive physiques ever, right? But that's
Yeah.
what he had to do to get it in, and it worked for him. So
Yeah.
he may have had a lot of. I mean, his stomach wasn't ultra flat in that home video that has made the rounds for years now. But he may have had some water in his GI, several pounds of water that made his look more optimal. So yeah, potassium, you need just adequate amount of potassium. Um, so, if someone says, I just ate sweet potatoes the entire time and they have the shits and et cetera, that, like, one of the advantages that is, it makes sense is that you have you're clearing out the mass from your bowels too. So your stomach stays flat. So you've
Mhm.
basically, you've got a little bit of you're giving yourself a little bit of a colonic during those days as well. So you're not so stopped up. So
Mm.
that's not the worst thing. But in terms of like the extra potassium, um, that potassium is, glycogen levels can vary tremendously, and the water will change depending on the glycogen levels. But the relative concentration of potassium has to stay within pretty refined limits in cells. You just can't like load a bunch of potassium and just make the cell balloon. That just won't work, because muscle cells depolarize when they're contracting, and that depolarization state depends on the balance of sodium potassium. Like, you can't be messing with that with contractile tissue like skeletal muscle. And so it's really enough potassium is important, but extra potassium, I don't think it's going to do much for you. But keeping your gut flat, if you don't mind the flushing effect and being on the toilet a lot, that could make a big difference for some people who tend to get bloated. So
it's a big consideration there, because a lot of those sources I would have seen people using would be have a decent amount of fiber in them too. So while you're getting obviously some extra potassium, could the fiber also be kind of working against you? Is just the big thing, as you said there. If it is kind of making you feel that little bit more bloated during the week, is it really worth the trade-off? I think probably keeping to a lot simpler sources and things that you get down a lot easier, the likes of white rice, so it's always a pretty handy one to get a lot of carbohydrates in. Honey.
The thing is, actually, the one person I'm thinking of right now who used sweet potatoes a good bit, it didn't bloat them. It was the opposite, because it filled them out well, but it gave them the shits. They had really loose stools, and it emptied their bowel. So that was good for that person. The Marcus Rule thing, like, who knows? Like, he ended up, I'm not sure why he did that. I never heard him explain his choice. It's interesting because I mentioned microbiome before. If there are studies comparing like white bread and maltodextrin in terms of the glycemic index and the profile in terms of blood glucose after a 100-gram dose, and it's all over the place. Some people have a higher blood glucose levels after the white bread. Some people higher after maltodextrin. The shape of the curves varies across individuals. It's really everywhere. And one of the things that is highly predictive of the insulin index or the insulin curve and the glucose index or glucose curve you get after a standardized meal, for instance, is the bacterial populations in your gut. So, and that's something that depends on the diet you've been eating previously. So, I think it brings up one point. Having eaten white rice, for instance, as one of your carbohydrate sources, is going to make people, and this is just, people have known this for years, this isn't rocket science. If you've been eating that food source during your prep, that's going to be a food source you're going to tolerate well if you eat more of it while you're doing your carb load, right? Yep. That probably has to do with the microbiome populations being adapted to that incoming carbohydrate source. But the other thing that's interesting is that some people are like, potatoes, white potatoes for them, or russet potatoes or sweet potatoes. How much you cook a potato also makes a difference as to how much the carbohydrates broken down with the glycemic index will be. Some people, it's white rice, what have you. But the glycemic index and the insulin index for a given food is highly variable depending on the person. So people are like, they look up the insulin index or the glycemic index and like, okay, well, this is the highest GI, so I'll use this food source. But that's not necessarily the case for you. So that's why some people find, hey, I need to do white rice. It's my golden ticket. I used to use sorbet. So I figured this out. Yeah. I have it worked great. I mean, there's probably a lot of fructose in there, but it didn't seem to matter the fruit source for the sorbet just worked phenomenally for me. There's also an easy way to get in a high density carbohydrate source with very little water. And some sorbets have a little bit of sodium, but most of them are sodium free. So then it makes the accounting easier in terms of sodium. I can get my sodium from other sources. Yeah. So, but everyone's GI and their microbiome is going to be different. And the insulin index, which is going to be important for how fast you load, how much insulin is released for a given amount of carbohydrate, how high the glucose levels go is going to dictate how much insulin is released. So how well you load up on a given carbohydrate source will depend upon you. So that's why it makes sense. Some people might just be because of their GI. It might be if they've been eating sweet potatoes during their prep as their carb source, not a bad choice, a pretty common choice, that their GI is really adept to that. Whereas, let's say you're doing white rice or brown rice, and if you tried to do sweet potatoes as your carb source, 800 grams of carbs, there'd be no friggin' way, because your microbiome isn't ready for that. It's not used to that. So, I mean, I have a buddy. It's one of my favorite examples, but he used to do a shitload the morning before his shows. You know what a shitload is? You know
No.
Okay. I'm going old school here. So skip load you'd heard of. Skip load is a playoff of shitload.
Okay.
So a shitload
I have an
strategy.
idea now.
Yeah. The shitload strategy, it basically comes from what would happen to people. They'd stick to their white rice and chicken and their really strict diet foods, and they would try to carb up on those. And then they do their show and okay, look good. And then they go eat all this shit that they really wanted to eat. And the next day they're like, holy crap, like I look friggin' amazing. Not that it's always the best stage look, but the vascularity is insane and they're really full. And they shitloaded, and they had fat in there as well. And fat loading, although the research isn't out there yet, but you could, for a larger guy, you can probably put on 1 or 2 kilos of stage weight with loading the intramuscular triglyceride levels.
Okay.
So, and also you look at stuff like ice cream, for instance, or cake, those have very high insulin indexes. So you take a shitload food, which would be typically high in sodium, which is going to help with glucose transport, and some fat and some glucose carb source, and it tastes really good. You'll get a cephalic insulin release. Your body's like, oh, hell yeah. And people will use a shitload strategy like on the morning of a show. So they'll wake up. And if I do this with athletes, you want to have those components, some sodium, some fat, and some carbohydrate in place. And typically you do this when you're in a quote unquote dehydrated state. So you don't have any water to lose. So you take in those things and you can fill out. And actually you can shitload if you've dried out previously and you've got a nice plateau in terms of what your body weight and your body water is, you can eat shitload foods for an entire day as long as you don't eat any water and not spill over. Like literally for 12, 18, even 24 hours. The problem is when you eat those foods, you want to drink water really, really bad. Sure. It's really, really hard. So if people would do a morning, it's one strategy you can use. You would want to practice this is the morning of the show. You've dried out. You're like, okay, I'm a little bit flat, but I know I'm dry. The mirror tells me this. My scale tells me this. Practice runs tell me this. And now I'm going to, without any water, take in some almond butter with some hash browns because I've had potatoes and there's salt in there and some eggs. I've been eating eggs. So sources of fat, carbohydrate, and salt that you previously eaten. And that would be like a standard breakfast. You could get at Denny's or IHOP or wherever. People do it with McDonald's, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they would have had McDonald's, or they know they tolerate. My friend that which I thought of brought the topic up. He used to get a Pizza Hut deep dish pizza, like a large pizza. He would order it the night before, so he would have it. He'd put it in the fridge in his hotel room, and he'd eat a whole, like at 7 a.m, before he'd have to get up and go do the things for the show. He'd eat the whole friggin' pizza. I mean, that would have been just absolute gastronomic disaster for me. Most people would be, they would be totally bloated. It would be either be farting, or he tolerated it perfectly. No problem at all. So some people can handle those things, and some people their microbiome, their GI is much more sensitive. So the carbohydrate source you use is something you want to try out, and you can try out, and it doesn't necessarily fit the black and white glycemic index. You need to use this, you need to use that. Sorbet. I've had people say, sorbet for the win. I get people tagging me and sending me messages all the time that they use sorbet work for them, right? But that's not going to work for everybody. At least I wouldn't expect it to. But so yeah, the carb source is going to be a very individual thing. The food sources too, and whether you could even do a shitload is going to be an individual thing. I think as
Yeah,
well.
and you with the shitload, if you can manage to stop yourself before it gets carried away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen too. Gosh, I was once a guy that he was in a show that I wasn't, he told us afterwards what happened, and he started to do a shitload and he couldn't stop himself. He lost
Yeah.
it. And I
I
was
can
like,
imagine.
oh man, I felt really bad for him. I felt really horrible for him. But
Yeah.
so
You'd want to have just access to like what you need
yeah,
and access to nothing else.
I'll tell you this, like the shitload is not fun.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the first few bites taste good, right? But then you want to drink water,
Hmm.
especially with and to eat that food, it's like, I'm not gonna. I would say something lewd, but it's like a pleasurable experience that is not pleasurable, right?
Hmm.
Because you want
Yeah.
the water after a while, and you have to eat the food to make it happen. It will work, but you can't take the water in that makes the meal enjoyable.
Mm. Yeah. I
So
can imagine.
that will limit people, I think, to some degree if they're not allowed to drink water. But if they drink the water and the shit, then you can totally screw the pooch.
Mm.
Then you can drop the
Yeah.
ball
And
pretty badly.
I can imagine as well after, like, because sometimes after having, like, say, for example, a big deep dish pizza, like,
Hmm.
obviously you have that dehydration there where you have all the sodium now and you're just parched to drink water. But then you also have this feeling of, like, I haven't eaten this food in so long that, like, my stomach can feel some way. I look great, but internally,
He was
it's
fine.
hard to smell.
He had no
He was
problem with
fine,
it.
was he?
Yeah, like
Okay.
people try
There
to
you
do
go.
McDonald's or whatever, that doesn't always work. But you can, many people, as long as the food sources of fat, carbs, and salt are the same, because most people are doing some sort of carb rotation, right? So they're taking in, they're maybe eating eggs as or a fatty meat or whatever. So you got fat and protein, right? And then they got carbs when they do their carb ups. So you just combine those. It may make for a really weird meal, right?
Yeah.
It's like almond butter and I mean, you could do almond butter on toast, right? On some bread that you would have been eating, or could be rice and almond butter with garlic salt in the rice or something like that. Um, and then you can evoke the shitload effect with foods and not have the GI distress that you were talking about.
Hmm.
But that's the thing. Like this is another, like, the chance to sort of step outside your psyche, is like, oh wow, I definitely want to eat that pizza. I've been craving that pizza, or the burgers or whatever. And the skill set here is to be disciplined and say, no, I'm eating this meal because I want to create the effect that I want to see on stage from
For a
this meal.
goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I guess obviously we've done carbing up justice here for sure. I am conscious of time all the same, but I do want to talk a little bit about the drying out, right? And I suppose that's going to put the bow on all this. So, from the drying out perspective, I guess, like, what would that entail, especially when you're going through with your own methods?
um, it will depend on your hydration status where you
Okay.
are. So um, some people will they'll do everything the same, their water intake the same, their sodium's the same, and then they just stop drinking water at 6 o'clock. They're done.
Okay.
Um, some people do like crazy water loading. I am not you don't need to do that. I've done that in the past where like 13 liters of water, with the intent, the premise behind this is that, your sodium is your primary extracellular electrolyte, right? And sodium concentrations are what are being regulated by your endogenous water homeostasis, hormone. So aldosterone, ADH, all that jazz, renin-angiotensin system. Um, so if you change sodium levels, then your body will regulate to bring those sodium concentrations back to where they once were. So the water loading idea would be you drink a bunch of water, right? And then you create diuresis. And when you lose water, there's going to have to be some sodium that goes with it. Water follows salt you've
Hmm.
probably heard that before, right? So
Hmm.
your total concentrate or total content of sodium will go down because you're peeing so much. And then what will happen is that you'll lose enough water to bring your sodium concentrations back up, But in doing so, your total body water will be less because you've lost sodium and the body has regulated itself around the sodium concentration as opposed to the water content. So you'll be dehydrated because of that. So you create this sort of overshoot phenomenon. You don't need to go to those extreme extents that some people do, where they just have no sodium and they take in tons of water. That will create that effect, but that doesn't need to be done. What I typically do with people, and a trial run makes sense. If you're really, really in shape, you can just stop drinking water at 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock. It depends on what you typically do. It depends on the total amount of water you're taking in. So the more water you consume regularly, the greater the regular homeostatic level of diuresis is. So if you're someone who drinks 2 liters of water a day, your system regulates water loss around 2 liters of water coming in, right? But if you're someone who typically drinks 8 liters of water a day, your system is regulating around that. So you've got a lot more play in there, so to speak, in the system, and the system is primed for diuresis. So I will typically, if possible, depending on how much water, if the person's drinking plenty of water already, not a big deal. You're good to go. But if someone's just doesn't drink water or doesn't take in a lot of fluid, I'll try to get them up to a reasonable amount. So 4 liters of water a day, at least a gallon, roughly, something like that.
Yeah.
And then what I typically do as a starting place, it could be 4 o'clock, it could be 6 o'clock. We'll sometimes go with when they go to sleep, what their typical schedule is. But I will have them consume, they have to know what their sodium content is, their daily sodium intakes. A lot of people are adding salt to their food. That makes it easier. The more sodium you have coming in, the more water you're having coming in, the more your system is active and the greater this effect will be. But what typically I do is I'll have people consume their regular rate of sodium coming in. So let's say they take in 300 milligrams of sodium in each of their meals, of their 6 meals. So they're doing 300, 300, 300, et cetera, et cetera. And I would have them, for instance, have to do 300, 300, 300. And let's say 100 of that comes from added salt. Or maybe that's 500 and 250 comes from added salt. And after that third meal, just stop adding salt to those meals. And those would also be low carbohydrate meals on that day. But I'm focused on just the water and sodium. And they would continue their water intake. So their water intake would be, let's say, 4 liters, 2 or 3 hours beyond that point. So let's say typically after that third meal, they're at 2 liters of water. They would remove the excess sodium, continue drinking more water. This creates the dilution of sodium because now the sodium has been removed. You've quote unquote cut sodium. You're still getting some sodium in your food, right? But the sodium intake has been cut back dramatically, but the water intake hasn't. Now you create a relative hyponatremia, so your sodium concentrations are low, and the body will okay, well, we got to bring sodium concentration back up. And the way to do that is to diurese. We'll get rid of water, and then we dehydrate the body, and there'll be some sodium that gets lost in that process, and the total body water will come down. And then that might be, you might stop drinking water at 5 o'clock. Let's say you've cut your sodium out at 2 o'clock, excess sodium, your water at 5 o'clock. And then the next day, it's not like you've not drank any water for 24 hours or 48 hours, something like that. You wake up the next day, and that type of principle would get people very, very dry. So that's the basic idea, is that you time things in that way where the relative sodium coming in gets dropped way down, and then the water coming in continues to go up, continues for some period of time. That dilutes the sodium. Then you drop the water, and the body just has to have some overshoot to get the sodium concentrations back up. And then you don't drink water for several hours, and you still have some water loss that will happen. And by the time you've woken up the next day and it's been 12, 15 hours, most people are going to be really dry. To facilitate that, so that's the sodium water piece of it. That day, I would typically have people remove carbohydrate. That'll help with the dropping water. and then take in higher levels of protein than they typically would. So it might be that they go to 300 grams of protein if they can that day versus 200 grams of protein.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that the protein is now their caloric source for the day, and they're stripping away the aminos, or the ammonia will, or the amino portions of the amino acids, so you can use the carbon backbones for fuel. And then you'll have to have diuresis to get rid of that sodium or the nitrogen from your amino acids. And that is a pretty powerful diuretic, actually. At the same time, too, I will have people take in multivitamins, B vitamins or a multivitamin, and vitamin C. Those are also freely lost through diuresis through in the filtration in the nephrons of the kidney. So the vitamin B vitamins, the vitamin C, you can also use like uva ursi or dandelion if you want. Those can have diuretic effects too. So that will facilitate water loss. So when you, for instance, cut your water off and it's 6 o'clock at night, and now you take in a couple grams of vitamin C and a few vitamin B complex pills, those facilitate the diuresis in a way that it wouldn't otherwise be happening, because that's novel. You haven't been doing that previously. You've tested out on a practice week. So that causes diuresis. And then the last thing that I will do, I think that's covered the basic stuff, is I do the I call it the bed trick, or the Batman trick. You basically use a head down tilt, and this is this was in, I think, in the article from 2021 on a scientific basis. Yeah. So this is kind of a cool little thing. So I figured this out when I was in grad school. One of the things that that happens when astronauts go into outer space is they no longer have gravity. So they don't have any orthostatic pressure pulling fluid down, because there's no gravity in outer space. So what happens is they get excessive venous return to their heart, to the right side of the heart where the blood is received from the systemic circulation. That stretches out the right heart. And there's actually a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide that causes natriuresis, which is sodium loss, which causes diuresis. So basically, the sensory mechanism there is blood volume is too high. Normally, gravity would be pulling the blood volume down, but without gravity, it's returning to the heart more so than it would otherwise. The heart's like, okay, we're getting overstretched. We have too much blood volume. We need to diurese or natriurese some of this blood volume away. So what they would do, so what happens with astronauts, they go into outer space. The first day or so, they pee a bunch because of this phenomenon. They lose plasma volume. And when the guys would come back down and on ground, and they'd have to do like press conferences, they were passing out. They had orthostatic hypotension because they didn't have the blood volume they needed just to maintain normal blood flow to the brain. So one of the ways that they would try to study the adverse effects of space flight was to simulate this loss of orthostatic pressure, loss of gravity, by doing bed rest studies with a head down tilt. So horrible friggin' subject. You'd have a horrible study to be in, but they paid them pretty well. You'd just lie in a bed for like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or longer, right? And that's the disuse atrophy. So you don't get to do anything. You don't get to walk around. You just like pee in a catheter, and you're getting muscular disuse. And they also have had that same effect on the cardiovascular system by putting you in a head down tilt. So what that means then is the blood drains down towards your heart, causes that atrial natriuretic peptide to be released, and causes the blood volume and plasma volume loss that the astronauts would experience. So they used about a 6-degree head down tilt to match what they were finding in the astronauts. And I thought to myself, okay, so we're causing diuresis by sleeping on a head down tilt like that. I think we should do that the night before a show to help dry out. And I started doing that like 20 plus years ago. I would bring like cinder blocks with me to the shows, or finally I got like the things you can use to jack up the bed, or I would go and grab like the couch in the hotel room and drag it across and put the bed up on it. And now I have people from all around the world tell me they did that. They send me pictures, of their bed, and I'm like, they don't even have to tell me what they're doing. I know what it is, right? So that's good for like 2 or 3 pounds of water loss at night if people do that. And you can go more than 6%. If you go too high, then you can literally feel the blood rushing to your head, and you can cause some gastric regurg too. So you don't want to cause reflux, because everything will be going the opposite direction when you're trying to sleep.
You almost see people do this at shows as well, like in the backstage area when they are like, I've seen people try to simulate it anyway. Like they're probably not getting like the head position, but they definitely have like their feet up elevated, trying to get their hips a little bit elevated. Probably
That's
similar.
the thing. I have to tell people, so that keeps the water from your legs, right?
Yeah.
But once it gets down to your hips, then you're still horizontal. And this is part of the reason why you lose water overnight, just lying in on a bed that's flat, right? Is because you don't have that gravitational pull, so you have greater venous return when you're just sitting there or you're just lying there. But you have to have your entire body at that angle in order to create the effect I'm talking about. So this is that's a great idea to keep, because if you're standing on your feet, you'll end up holding water in your legs potentially. But this is something that it's not going to happen that fast, but it's pretty powerful. But you have to get the entire bed jacked up, right? So you can't just take some pillows and put them under your legs. That won't do it. You need to get the blood flow, the venous return to your heart elevated, and that has to happen by meaning your torso's at that downward angle.
You need to invest in a few decline crunches and stick them all together.
You can buy like bed feet. They're like little plastic things, like they sell them at Walmart or whatever. Back in the day, this tells you how long I've been doing this. I used to get the yellow pages. Now you don't have yellow pages anywhere, but I get the phone book, right?
I remember them.
Yeah, and I go around. Sometimes I go down to the hotel and I say, "Hey, I don't have a yellow pages in my room. Could I get one from you?" And I already did, of course, and I get an extra one, just so I have one for each leg, right?
Yeah.
And I would use that, and then put a bunch of pillows under there and jack it up. So when you've switched, so to kind of summarize, you go to the day of you've filled, you've spilled. This is the typical procedure that I would use. And then you've got extra water that you need to get rid of, but you're sure you're full. So that's good. Now you drop your carbs, increase your protein. Your sodium intake stays the same meal by meal. Your water intake stays the same meal by meal, but you just stop adding sodium, or you cut your sodium back to minimal levels midday some point in time. Continue your regular rate of water intake, but cut that off 2 or 3 hours later. And then just as you're cutting off the water, you add in the B vitamins, you add in the vitamin C, you continue to eat more protein. So you've got plenty of ammonia you need to get rid of. And then you do the head down tilt trick, the bed trick. And most people end up, what I use as the standard is I will have people follow their weight throughout the whole week. And typically morning waking weight will be the lowest after several days of low carb training before the carb up. So let's say it's 200 pounds. And let's say you carb up to whatever, 215, and then you come back down, and then you might be like 205 the day before the show. And if you wake up, and if you're at that pre-carb up body weight in the morning when you wake up, or below that, you're almost certainly dry as a bone, because you've got all the carbohydrate and whatever water is associated with that in the muscle, but your body weight is the same. So let's just say you loaded 1,000 grams of carbs during your carb up. So you put on 2.2 pounds just of glycogen, and there's some actually protein that goes along with that glycogen and protein. But so that's just the carbohydrate. And let's just say it's 1-to-1. So it's not just 1,000 grams of carbs, but 1,000 grams of water. So 2 kilos, 4.4 pounds. So that's the extra muscle weight that you've created through the carbohydrate loading process. And now, so you should be 204, all of the things being equal. But now instead of 204, with the 4.4, you're 199. So now you're down 5 pounds of water weight with an extra 4+ pounds of muscle weight. That's going to make a difference.
Yeah, that's peaked.
That's
That's peaked.
then you wake up and you're tumbleweed, right? You're dry
Yeah,
as a bone, right?
yeah,
Um, so that's why the scale weight is so helpful, because like your weight's like, holy shit, I went from 200 to 215 and now I'm at 205 and I still look watery. And now, okay, once you follow those numbers, like, okay, I just got to follow the scale here. And it helps so much to know, like, okay, it's okay. And here's the thing that's sort of important. I follow your weight will change, of course, week for week as you're dieting down. So let's say you do a peak week 4 weeks out, and and instead of being 200 the day before your carb up, you're 206.
hmm
But you go from 206 to 221 to 211 and then 205, something like that, right? But you can see the changes in weight stage by stage throughout the peak week. So when you get to the actual peak week, instead of being 205 before your carb up, you're 200. You're going to still expect to go up 10 or 15 pounds, whatever it is. It might be 8, could be 6.
Yeah.
It varies dramatically. But you see that pattern. So you go up this much. It's kind of like the plane. It goes up, it comes down, it goes up, and you're changing in elevation by 1,000 feet each stage, or 500 feet. So you watch those changes and you say, okay, well, this is fine. I went up by 12 pounds, which is what I expected. I came down by 7 pounds, what I expected. And now if I go down by another 5 pounds, I will be dead on.
yeah.
And let's say you wake up in the morning at 4 o'clock. Oh, there's one other thing I forgot too. It's kind of important on the day before the show. Caffeine, totally legal. You can use caffeine.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
as long as your caffeine levels aren't sky high, the more, I don't think they really test that at most natural
Nah,
shows, but
nah.
you can use as much caffeine as you want. So let's say you wake up the morning of and you're like, okay, good. I'm hoping I would be 199 at 7 a.m. and I'm 203 at 4 a.m. Okay, I'm probably not going to sleep anyway. Give yourself 200 milligrams of caffeine, and that will induce more of a diuretic
Yeah.
effect, and that will get you back on track to where you think you want to be. And that would be an objective way. Okay, you're in the middle of the night and you're looking at your in the mirror and you're half asleep and your coach is asleep, and you've got that scale weight to tell you what to do, and you know you want to get down in weight. You need to hurry this up a little bit. Okay, fine. Add some more caffeine. The morning of that show too, the important thing you can watch on the day before is what's happening with weight as you go down. So what ideally I will want to see is that someone has reached a plateau or a low point. So they've gotten down, they wake up at 4 o'clock and they're 199 and a half. And then they wake up at 7:30 and they're 199.2. And then they're 199.1, 199.1. They're totally there. There's no more water to be dropped. Then they know they're dry, right? So then they could potentially have carbohydrate if they wanted to, if they felt like they're a little flat and not be worried about it. Or they could do a shitload if they've done that before and it worked out, right? That would be the time to do it. But I've had people tell me in retrospect, like they went and they did not get that plateau. They did not get that bottoming out effect on their body weight. They were still dropping water because they had so much water from the carb up and they didn't time things properly. So to give you some insight as to how I work with people, say, okay, so this is what we found. We cut your sodium off at 2, we cut your water off at 5, and when you woke up in the morning, when we wanted you to be dry, you were 202 and we wanted you at 199. It took another 3 hours to get there. Let's say another 2 hours to get there. All we do is we go back in time to Friday and we shift everything back 2 hours. We cut the sodium off 2 hours earlier. We cut the water off 2 hours earlier. Maybe you use an extra 200 milligrams of caffeine if it doesn't screw with your sleep or what have you. We make minor adjustments so that we land the plane at the time we want to land the plane at 0 feet of elevation on the ground when it's time to be dry, so that we can have some carbohydrate, or we can have a shitload, or we can be dry for the time when we know we're going to be on stage. So following the scale weight tells you what's going on with your water weight, especially in those very controlled circumstances. Yeah. And I'll just add this because I'm kind of on a roll here. is when people do their practice week, sometimes they will go all the way up until that point when the prejudging would happen. And then they say, well, I had a conservative rice and chicken meal and I looked pretty good and I was happy. I didn't spill over, but I was maybe a little bit flat. And so that was my practice week. And then I just went and did whatever. I just drank a bunch of water and I had, the cheat meal we had plaid or whatever it's going to be. That is a golden opportunity to see, well, what if I were to have some sodium and some fat and some carbohydrate? Or what if I were to try a bunch of sweet potatoes? Or whatever experiment is that based on your circumstances might be something that could work. Then you have the chance to say, okay, what if I have a burger and fries, right? I know I can handle a burger and fries. That was my cheat meal. I've been doing it for weeks. What happens if I tried the chicken and rice? It really didn't do much. I went and had a burger and fries or had the Big Mac or the Whopper or whatever. Holy moly, this was awesome. I looked just the way I wanted to. Now you know, because you practice that a burger and fries is what you should probably do in place of the rice and chicken and rice, or what you would do maybe after the chicken or rice, because you practice that. And then if you want, depends on how stressed the person is, you can even then go throughout the day and say, oh, what happens if I keep my water low? Let's say I only take in 1 or 2 liters of water. Can I get even drier? Yeah. I think I'm dry. I look dry, but I could be even drier, or maybe I could be even fuller. So you have the whole rest of the day to play around and get a sense of, is there more glycogen that could be stored? Is there more water that could be lost? What is potentially, and there's no stress. It doesn't matter if you push too hard and you spill over and you look like shit. Well, then we're not going to do that. So you worked all that. You spent literally from Sunday until Saturday getting yourself into this very unique physiological scenario where you're carb loaded, you're relatively dehydrated, and now you have the opportunity to really screw around and mess with things and see if you can optimize your look. And it's when you're in really good shape, things can change really, really fast in that scenario.
Yeah.
And that's what I really love doing during peak week is doing that practice day. And, what happens if I drink the thing of Gatorade? Do I just spill over immediately, or do I fill out and I look really, really good, right? And if you make a mistake, it's no big deal. There's no pressure. You just don't do that when it comes to the actual show week. So, but that's the day of the show is for dropping the water, you remove whatever things might be in your diet that cause stress, or if someone's yohimbine can be a supplement that I would have taken out if people are using that. People use growth hormone, would not do that. There are some enhanced guys that actually would do things to fill out on the day before, if they had to make weight, for instance, but that's an entire other story. So you've removed those things that cause water retention. You've added protein, you've added caffeine, you've manipulated your sodium in your water in that way. The B vitamins, you do the head down tilt. You watch a funny movie and you totally chill out and have fun and are really grateful for everything that's going on. You wake up the next day and you just check the scale, and the scale basically tells you what you can see in the mirror. And it's just okay, it's time to go, baby. It's game day.
The plane has landed.
The plane has landed. Yeah,
here.
Exactly.
There you go.
You open it up and you go and kick ass and have fun.
Scott, that was a masterclass there. I really, really appreciate that, because I know people are going to find a ton of value in everything there. But look, you've been very generous with your time, so really appreciate it. It's been fucking 2 hours, God.
No worries. No worries. Yeah, it's two and a half hours.
Yeah, sure. Look, here, I really appreciate your time. If you have anywhere that people can find out more of, where to find your book, for example, your other podcasts, if you want to share them here, that'd be great. Yeah,
it's Fortitude Training on Instagram, and then you can just type in "Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach." The book's on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So, yeah, I see people selling it on eBay for more than what it costs on Amazon. I'm not sure why you would do that. I'm not sure why they're doing that, but who knows? But if you buy it from Amazon, then it comes to me. If you buy it I do have it available. I think I have 1 copy available on eBay that I can sign, and all of the money goes to Feeding America. We've got some crazy things going on right now with supplemental nutrition, the SNAP program, people on food stamps. So I'm trying to help out where I can. So I think there's one copy available for someone who wants to do that. All the proceeds go to Feeding America, which articulates with SNAP to help people put food on the table. And today's Thanksgiving here in the U.S., so there's probably some people who aren't eating right now. So it's a good day for actually me to remind people that they can do that. So, and I just need to order some more books, and then I can sell them that way. But I think there's just one copy at this point. It's available for that.
Awesome. I'll leave. I'll find those links and I'll put them into the description.
Okay.
So people can have a look at them. So yeah, that's incredible. And obviously you have Muscle Minds as well on the Think Big Bodybuilding Media, which is a really good listen. Anybody, if you get more Scott in your ear holes more frequently if you listen to that. But that's a fantastic podcast. Look. Really appreciate your time, man. I will leave all that in the description. If at home you have been enjoying the podcast, please do make sure to leave me a rating and review. The podcast platform that you're listening on. Go over, give Scott a follow, give his podcast a listen, buy his book, and we will catch you in the next one.